We are recording this session from this point, so please act accordingly. Okay, so we also made available, and as it always is, our true time capacities are available in real time on the system. So customers, when they're looking at a particular trip, they can see the loads on a bus, and that also was available to our dispatch team. So we had some ready reserve buses when we had the manpower and the vehicles. We had some ready reserve buses that could be deployed into the system to help alleviate some of those crowds if something developed. And during this time period, we actually did reinstate normal service or closer to normal service on 4 routes to assist with social distancing. There were some trips, and in particular, Route 51, the Carrick route comes to mind, where ridership did not decline as much as the rest of the system, and so we needed to continue to provide closer to a normal schedule so that we could ensure that customers had spacing. Next slide, please. In May, we moved to the yellow service level, and we actually had been planning for this stretch over some time with the proviso that we knew that companies and businesses were still going to be continuing to telework. There was not going to be, we didn't think, a huge increase in demand as customers started to return to downtown or to other parts of the county. And we monitored the ridership during this phase and noted that indeed that was the case. In fact, it stayed flat or even continued to decline a little bit during the first week of the yellow phase. We also considered what was going to happen in Oakland. The university system did not come back to in-person classes. Students had already gone home, those that could. And so we continued to have limited service going through the Oakland corridor. And that enabled us to meet our daily ridership demands as well as the cleaning demands for the fleet. So as I said, we were at 71 routes, had reduced service in the red level. We went down to 32 routes with reduced service during the yellow level. So that represents about a 12% reduction in hours and miles. So just about half of the service that we had cut back was returned. As I said, we did not increase we noted no increase in ridership on our commuter routes. And in fact, that has still been quite slow to recover. I'll have some slides to show that. And light rail ridership was down about 90% at the start of the pandemic, and it has continued to lag behind. Okay, next slide, Jeff. So quite quickly, after 2 weeks, we moved into the green phase. And again, the telework is still encouraged, and companies are asked to continue to encourage employees to stay home if at all possible. And so we started looking at what we could do for green service. And that had meant that we were starting to monitor what was happening with downtown. We were talking to some of our partners at Pittsburgh Downtown Partnership and the Allegheny Conference to determine what they're hearing about employers downtown and if workers were going to be coming back. And we expected, and it's been borne out, that the demand, at least downtown, has been very slow to ramp back up. We have maintained the same level of service in yellow that we did in green, but we do monitor the ridership. We have been trying to take a look at the data, and if need be, we will add service back. We are planning on a return to a full level of service on August 23rd, which would be our next service change, our next pick. That is somewhat dependent on the manpower being available. We still have a number of employees who are out for precautionary reasons. And so getting those employees back to work will be important. And we have continued to step up our protocols and gotten more streamlined with the cleaning service. So we feel comfortable that we will have a clean product out. We also, during the green phase, returned to front door boarding, after the first week where we allowed customers to board through the front door, but did not require exchange of fares. The second week, starting June 8th, we started having customers pay their fare using the Connect card or cash through the front. And the ridership has maintained steady during the green phase. We have not seen a large influx of riders. Let's go to the next slide, Jeff, and we can take a look at some of the ridership charts. Sorry, it's a little hard to see, but let me just cover some of the trends here. So on these charts, you've got bus ridership on the top and then rail ridership on the bottom. And what you see in the gray lines is essentially the typical service that was last year during the equivalent weeks. And you saw that we would have ridership on the bus of about 190,000 people a day on a typical weekday. And in early March, just as the pandemic was starting to hit, we were close to those levels. Then as we started to go to both voluntary shutdown and then the red phase, you can see the ridership in the red dropping significantly to the point where we were down probably about 85% at first on the bus side. We've seen some recovery. We're at about 70% of normal ridership now. You can see that the ridership has sort of gradually increased as the weeks go by. However, we are still down about 70% from normal. The good news, if you want to play with statistics, is we're up 60% from our lows during the pandemic, but that still represents a huge drop. Now, on the T, the rail ridership has it dropped and it has stayed down. We dropped about 90%, as I said earlier, from our normal levels, and we are still down about 80% from normal. You can see that as we got into the green phase, there was a small recovery, but it hasn't been as pronounced as the bus side. And so we continue to talk to downtown employers, get a sense of what's happening there. As the riders have come back, we are starting to look at the need to go back to a more regular service on the T. And so we're strongly considering it. I don't know if we've made any announcements of when that's going to happen, but it will start soon. Moving to the next slide, Jeff. Access was also, of course, significantly affected by what was happening with the pandemic. While the ridership is quite a bit lower than the other modes, it's still increasingly important during this time. We saw about 75% declines in ridership during the pandemic. However, there were a number of riders who had to continue to ride for medical reasons, typically, maybe for dialysis or some other medical treatment that they needed. And so Access stepped up and continued to provide that service for customers. They also implemented masks and daily vehicle disinfection. They also implemented some physical distancing rules that required more space on the vehicles themselves. They also came up with a couple creative solutions to use some of their resources in an efficient way and an effective way during the pandemic. They got a grant through the Pittsburgh Foundation and through United Way to sponsor food deliveries throughout the region. So there were some areas of the county where we needed to, or Access provided some of that essential service to customers who were unable to get out to a grocery store and get their groceries. PennDOT also allowed Access to go to same-day service. Typically, you have to call ahead and make a reservation for Access service, but on a space-available basis, customers were able to request service on the day of. But like the other modes, the Access ridership dropped significantly. A normal month would see just over 4,000 riders. During the red phase, we were down to about 1,000 riders a day. We're starting to creep up to about 1,600 a day. So again, playing with statistics, we're up 60% from where we were, but still quite low. So what are we doing now with the recovery? Next slide, please, Jeff. So As I talked about, we worked frequently with our partners downtown and throughout the county. The City of Pittsburgh, DOMI, had an initiative called Reopen PGH that brought leaders from various disciplines to talk about how best to restart the economy and get workers and customers feeling safe about coming downtown and about being able to dine downtown or work out deliveries and pick up of their goods that they wanted to buy. And so I participated on that panel that looked at, and you'll start to see over the summer, some creative initiatives to enable more outdoor dining and enable those businesses to get back on their feet, which is critical for Allegheny County. We also are working with Pittsburgh Downtown Partnership on some of our downtown bus stops. We're coordinating signage, we're coordinating activities to ensure that we can provide, to the extent possible, social distancing opportunities for customers and give them a consistent look and feel as they're moving through downtown or moving through other parts of the community so that they know what to expect. And so for those of you who have been downtown, you'll see arrows on the sidewalks and arrows in buildings. And so it all has a similar look and feel. And that kind of nomenclature and look will be provided for some of our downtown bus stops as well as some of the same signage. We are also working with the Oakland TMA for some dining opportunities in the Oakland area as well. And as I said, we're in a new world. We're talking to businesses, we're talking to the PDP and DOMI and other groups to understand how the ridership is changing and how will telecommuting impact the demand for transit. We're talking to those businesses, and actually this is part of the next transit, the long range plan, which I'll also cover, to identify what does the new role for transit play, or how will transit serve the community in the future. And I'm actually, frankly, pretty excited about how we're positioned to talk to customers, talk to stakeholders, and understand how Port Authority can pivot to a more prosperous future there. We're also seeing some national lessons. Just this weekend, The Atlantic had an article about how transit was maybe unfairly maligned as a superseder of COVID cases. And the article kind of faulted some of the research that was done by a major university in the Northeast. And so it kind of called out that actually you have quite a bit of safety that's provided by transit. It's in many cases, it's the only way for people to get to work. It certainly is the efficient way for people to get back to work. And frankly, I think transit is going to be the thing that helps restart the economy. And so I was glad to see that there was sort of a counter article to the perception that transit was a cedar of virus spread and actually facilitated some of the recovery of the economy. So that's what's happening on COVID. Maybe I'll pause there and just see if there's any questions or comments around the pandemic that I can answer or pass on to others.
David, this is Ann. I just had a quick question. I was interested in knowing what the other routes were. I think it was in the yellow phase that you said you reinstated because the demand hadn't really fallen off that much, besides the 51 you mentioned? Yes.
So Philip, can you help me out on this, on the other 3 routes that we return service on? I don't want to misspeak.
The other routes that we returned service on was the 16, the 51, the P1, and additional various trips on the red line during that phase. And then that was pre-yellow phase. But as we went into the yellow phase, we implemented we brought back all the local and coverage routes to normal schedule in the yellow phase.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Okay, hearing no other questions, I'm going to move on to some other planning updates. Jeff, if you can advance, I think it's going to be 2 slides maybe. So just a couple other items I wanted to keep you apprised of. This was an exciting month for Next Transit, which is our long-range planning process. Early this month, I guess it still feels early to me, but earlier this month, we started the website, which is nexttransit.network. That will be the hub for people to provide public comment and to activate some of their thought process so that we can incorporate that into our transit planning for the future. We also have a values survey and a gaps analysis that's going to begin next month. We're doing some engagement internally with Port Authority stakeholders and our steering committee, but that will be going broader next month. We also have some station and park and ride improvement planning that's going to kick off over the next few months, particularly at Wilkinsburg Station and at Carnegie Station. We've had some opportunities there to coordinate with some local development and maybe rethink how those park and rides interact with their surrounding communities and can be both supportive of the community as well as increased transit ridership. And not coincidentally, the planning department also just recently received an FTA grant of nearly $700,000 that will help support our transit-oriented communities staff as we look at some of the transit access improvements. This is focused on the East Busway, particularly as it overlaps on our BRT corridor between Oakland and Wilkinsburg, but will give us an opportunity to work with the communities and identify where transit-oriented development may be supportive of both community development and transit. And then we briefly, I think this happened the day before the board meeting last month, but just to give you an update, we did receive a tweet from the president talking about our Small Starts grant for the BRT project that announced that $99.995 million has been allocated from the federal budget. So what that means is the grant has not been awarded, but it does mean that once the project does meet all of the project readiness requirements, then we will be first in line or essentially guaranteed of that funding, again, assuming we meet those requirements. And the requirements are the readiness review. The FTA hires in their standard process, they hire a project management oversight consultant. And the PMOC will come in, evaluate the project plan, evaluate the resourcing, evaluate the communications plan, the right-of-way plans and such to ensure that the project is ready to receive the funding. And then also just making sure that the local match has been obtained and obtained officially. So we will be continuing to work on the readiness over the rest of this year and look forward to, on our current plan, would look forward to a grant announcement early next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Philip for a few other service development initiatives and some updates on some recurring programs. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good morning, committee members. This is Philip St. Pierre, Director of Service Development with Port Authority. And this is a brief update on two major projects with two major service development projects. And we'll also talk about some potential changes for next year's service. The first project that I'd like to talk about is the bus stop consolidation project. This project has been placed on hold due to the COVID-19 situation. Prior to the COVID-19 situation, we've been working on incorporating more public outreach efforts that would require us to get out into the community, talk, have more face-to-face discussions with the communities, more pop-up events at bus stops to talk to passengers. So due to the social distancing guidelines, we've placed this project on hold. But we have not stopped working on improving our bus stop infrastructure and signage out into the communities. So while our focus has been mainly the COVID-19 situation, we have transitioned our staff to our service development associate staff to accomplish route reviews. They've been out there evaluating every single route in the system, looking at signage, looking at shelters, seeing things that need to be taken care of. To date, over 480 work orders have been developed that are currently in the process of being worked on. Those work orders include, bus stop signs that are missing. They may be faded, they may be leaning, or they have some type of an obstructed view, such as tree branches or some type of something that may be in the way. So this is going to be very helpful to our customers and our operators that rely on those signs to make sure that they pull up to the stop. They know that this is a stop, and prevent pass ups. So we're really proud of our staff to adapt and be able to work on those route reviews. And as passengers start returning to the system, they're going to see brand new signs out there and in a better condition. The next project is the shelter replacement project. This project was also impacted due to the COVID-19 situation. Our vendor is located in Michigan, and they had a more aggressive shutdown plan in that state, and so they were impacted. They had to shut down their operations for some time. So that impacted our timeline, but they have resumed operations, and we are looking to complete the next phase, the phase 3 of the shelter replacement program, late September and October, and we're on track to replace approximately 33 to 35 shelters during that time frame. Next slide, please. So in addition to those major projects, we're also looking at what service additions that we can do for next fiscal year. So earlier last year, we implemented or we brought to the board a updated fiscal year 19 update to the transit service standards. We are still progressing on that timeline of those new transit service standards. And so all of the service requests that have been collected in fiscal year 20 and before are currently in the evaluation phase. So that report is for the annual service report is planned to be updated in this upcoming November for public release. And those will have all the rankings of all the projects. And those projects are slated to be implemented in fiscal year 22. So while that's a longer timeline of getting new projects implemented in fiscal year 22, we want to look at what projects that we're capable of implementing in fiscal year 21. So we evaluated what could we do, and a lot of the projects that we implemented even this year was weekend service. And so we want to put an emphasis on getting 7-day service on our local and coverage and rapid routes. And that's what we requested in the budget for this for next fiscal year. So on the list here of all the routes, these are routes that are operating maybe 5 or 6 days of the week, and we'd like to get those routes up to 7 days daily service for those routes. This was an emphasis prior to COVID-19 situation, but I think the COVID-19 situation also emphasized the need for communities to have daily service. With crowding, during the weekdays and at peaks, if folks and communities can get around on a Saturday or Sunday rather than Monday through Friday, it could help alleviate some of those crowding concerns in the future. But so that's what we're looking to achieve in fiscal year 21. It will require a minor update to the transit service standards, and I'll brief you on that on the next slide. But the only route that's not on this list that requires or that we're going to place on hold at this time is the Route 71. And we're delaying that initiative right now due to the Kenmar Bridge project. So after the completion of that project, we'll be looking to add weekend service for that route. Next slide, please. So what are the next steps to implementing that 7-day service? So we're going to be looking to bring to the board, we're going to develop and get board adopted updated transit service standards in July. And basically, we're just going to update the language to say that we're going to put up an emphasis and priority on local and coverage routes to operate with daily service. So right now, rapid routes are operating on a daily service, but on that previous slide, there are local and coverage routes that do not operate on a Saturday or Sunday schedule, or both. So upon the budget and the transit service standard adoption, we'll be able to implement these proposed fiscal 21 additions next year. And tentatively, we're planning to implement that in November of 2020. Title VI, so the next steps for Title VI is that we would formally present to ACTC and the Port Authority Committee, Planning Committee, and the board in July. And just a minor or just a brief update on the Title VI, because these are all service additions, just like last year with all the service additions that we implemented fiscal year 20. We do not anticipate that there's going to be any adverse impacts expected on minority or low-income persons, because these are all service additions. So at this time, that concludes my briefing, and I believe it concludes the entire briefing of the Planning and Stakeholder Committee, and we'll be able to take any questions at this time.
Hi, this is Laura. I have my hand raised, but I don't know if I'm allowed to speak. Are stakeholders allowed to ask questions at this point?
John, we can't hear you if you're talking.
This is Catherine. Based on past practice with our committee, I'm going to presume that the committee chair would allow a question at this point.
Great. Thank you so much. I actually have a few questions. I first want to say that we are, as PPT, very excited about the report that Philip just gave on the weekend service. We are really grateful and think that it's very, very important for all local routes to have access to service on weekends. So we celebrate that decision. I have a couple questions, I think, mostly for David Huffaker. The first was, what indications do you have that it actually makes sense to return to normal service levels rather than enhancing service on routes that seem to be regularly experiencing overcrowding? And is there any consideration given to increasing frequency higher than pre-COVID levels because of the diminished capacity on buses?
So, okay, yeah, now my mic's on. So it's a good question, and we are somewhat limited in what we can do as far as adding frequencies on some of these routes. I think we're monitoring and trying to react as quickly as possible on balancing between what's happening with commuter routes and what's happening with some of the other local service. And I think that's one that we're just continuing to study. We have to be careful, because once we put it into a PIC, then it's ratified for the next several months. And we need to make sure that we've got adequate capacity, knowing what we know about people coming back to downtown and what we know about our ability to stay in the green level or even move beyond post-green, whatever that might look like. I think we may still need to have the capacity available for commuters to come back downtown. It's a big unknown right now, and we're also looking at what other agencies are doing as well. I think what I'm seeing primarily is people are maintaining that capacity for commuters, but it's an outstanding question. I don't have the answer.
Will the Port Authority start releasing data or report on crowding by route? And can we see whether the trajectory around crowding has changed or improved or pass-ups? Because anecdotally, we're talking to riders at bus stops very regularly and hearing that people are regularly being passed up, particularly in communities that are later sort of like farther along in the service. So the routes will get crowded in towards the origin of the service, and then by the time it gets to their community, people are regularly getting passed up. So will we see that data so that we can see that we're moving in a trajectory where that won't be as consistently happening?
So a couple things on that. One, we do have True Time, which shows the real-time capacity and demand on that route. But I recognize that doesn't allow for a lot of planning. That just tells you what's happening right in that moment. We are working on a tool that will allow customers to see typical crowding on trips so that we can provide some better information for trip planning. I think you'll hear more about that over the next week or so. We hope that will provide some benefit. We do monitor, and Philip's team monitors the complaints and the notifications about pass-ups, and so that is something that definitely is being taken into account, and I think it really is one of those driving forces that's going to help us evaluate if we have the service properly placed. And so your point of pass-ups is an important one, and it's one that I'm very cognizant of, and Philip's team is monitoring closely.
Yeah, I appreciate that you're going to provide the data of how crowded routes are. I think that I think for many riders, there's only a limited amount that they can adjust their schedules to accommodate, buses that are crowded. So I think to the extent that at a service level, there are changes to make sure that that doesn't happen. We appreciate you looking into that. And then I guess the last set of questions I have is just around fare impacts. And I wonder if you've started to see any data around the impact of reinstating the fares on ridership, particularly ridership by route, as well as impact on cash usage on buses.
So we've got about a week of data on that, but we don't have enough data to be able to say anything pretty well informed at this point. We will keep the board posted and come back. We'll have committee meetings next month, and we will have included this information on what we're seeing with the impacts to ridership in our next committee meeting.
Okay, thank you.
I see another person named John with their hand raised. John Peg. All right, so I've remuted that line, John, if that is you. Okay.
I think the issue at this point, we can take this last question, but we're running out of time, so we're going to need to have to adjourn to go into the next meeting. So I would suggest taking that last question.
Yeah, Chair Letwin, could you please move to close the planning meeting?
Okay, if there are no other questions, then I would make a motion that we adjourn this meeting and move into the next meeting.
This is Ann, so moved or seconded.
This is Michelle. Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. John, sorry to steal your thunder. Let's go into the next meeting.
Okay, this is Ann, and we can go ahead and get started with the Finance Committee. The first agenda item today is approval of minutes for the May 21st Finance Committee meeting. I'll give a second if anybody has any questions or corrections to the minutes. And do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
This is Michelle. Second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. The minutes are approved. Our second agenda item is the resolution to adopt the FY 2021 budget. And I'll turn it over to Keith to describe that resolution. Sorry, Catherine, if you were going to take the lead on that.
Yeah, we're going to go through the presentation first, and before I turn it over to Catherine, I just did want to take a moment to thank the staff in the financial planning and also the grants department, most notably Tia Gunn, Ed Typansky, Curtis Anthony, and Joe Kelly and Sean Tregeser. This truly is a 6-month process. We added, for the benefit of all managers and directors this year, a educational component, training component to help managers and directors learn more about, especially new ones, learn more about the information that's available for each of the departments, and it helps with fine-tuning their requests, and then also the follow-up meetings where we do go through and look at requests versus what historically has been spent. So without their contributions over the past 5 and 6 months, this certainly wouldn't be possible. So I did want to take a moment, and most of them are on this call, so I did want to put a shout out to them. Now I will turn it over to Catherine.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us by WebEx. This is our second conversation on our preliminary budget proposed for fiscal 21. It's very similar to the presentation from last month, and short version, while almost everything financially has changed in our world since the 12th and 13th of March, the budget we are proposing looks very similar to what we would have brought forward without the pandemic. It makes it easier for us to track the delta on expenses, specifically for reimbursement purposes on the CARES Act. We received $141 million under the congressional approval for the CARES Act, and this money is designated to cover expenses related to the COVID pandemic. So this money is enabling us to cover lost revenues on fares waived for the safety purposes of not being at the front of the bus. It does not allow us to implement new or alternative fare structures, but it does allow us to recoup missed fares. It allows us to recoup other lost revenues, and it allows us to cover the overtime and costs for additional sanitation. Again, every vehicle, bus and rail, is cleaned before it goes back out into service. You will see in this budget a proposed addition of nearly 60 positions to be able to cover the cleaning of vehicles and facilities during this pandemic. So we have been spending an awful lot in overtime and unbudgeted expenses. CARES Act is making us whole. We anticipate spending all of that next year and balancing our budget with reserves at some point in the year. And again, the Port Authority strategy is to keep service at the level we are at. As soon as we can get back to full service is great, but have as much service as possible on the street and our people gainfully and fully employed. So as we get through the end of the year and we start seeing what our longer ridership trends and pandemic trends will be, we're able to make the most informed decisions to go forward if we need to restructure service or the agency. So having said that, I will turn this back over to Pete Schenk, and I do want to thank the finance team for trying to put this together, well, actually accomplishing putting together a budget in what is financially crazy situation. And also, all of the staff that's worked on this, we are taking the stance that any changes we make this year may be the last ones we can substantively make. So how do we get ready for the next 3 years to be flexible for the people who rely on us, both as patrons and employees and business partners, and deliver the service that our communities need? So I'll turn it over to Pete Schenk.
Thank you, Catherine. So as we've mentioned at some of the prior meetings, there is great uncertainty surrounding the resources that typically are devoted to Port Authority, both from a operating and capital budget. The Commonwealth has passed a 5-month general fund budget, so there would be some expectation obviously they'll have to address the additional 7 months. So we're, just keeping our fingers crossed in terms of that there wouldn't be any further impact on the amounts that have been this point projected from the Commonwealth from both the operating and the capital budget. Obviously, we also do have the uncertainty surrounding the turnpike payments, which predominantly impact the capital budget. This is the capital budget is assuming that those turnpike payments would continue in fiscal 2021 to the tune of $114.5 million. The local subsidies have been impacted in the form of lower sales tax, and when we get to the May financials, you'll begin to see that with ridership projections, as David Huffaker mentioned at the prior meeting. We've seen a significant reduction, and that in turn has impacted our passenger revenues for both April and May, and seems to be continuing at least for the first 2 weeks in June. We are also going through and evaluating RFP responses for our health care, so there's some assumptions made in the current fiscal 21 operating budget. Obviously, if we come to an agreement with our healthcare providers where there could be some savings that are not indicated in the operating budget, that could be included in a subsequent operating budget. So there is a possibility for a revised operating and capital budget. So looking at the 2020 budget status, and we are still projecting a significant operating deficit that will be addressed through CARES Act funding. On the good news front is that the past, for April and May, our non-COVID related expenses actually were trending below budget. So what that means is that there's the ability for the CARES Act funding to possibly last a month or two longer than was initially projected. Our ridership continues to remain significantly down, and our combined passenger revenues for April and May were down a total of $14.9 million. Vehicle capacity is reduced, which is then also impacting the passenger revenues, since we do have a finite amount of vehicles that we can put out on the street. And then there's also the issue of some of the major downtown employers continuing to promote remote work environments, which is having an impact on our commuter population. The total budget operating income items for June, we have $7.3 million budgeted in passenger revenues. I would expect that we'll probably be down about $5.5 to $6 million in passenger revenues based on the first 2 weeks in June. We are also, we have budgeted $17 million in local subsidies just for the month of June, which would be eligible, that shortfall would be eligible for CARES funding. And then the 2020 budget was balanced using over $22 million in deferred revenue, and we are going to work with both our internal auditor and also some external legal counsel just to verify that deferred revenue, that we can use CARES funding to augment that deferred revenue so that we can keep our reserves at their current amounts. Sorry. Okay, so so as I mentioned, the projected deficit for 2020, assuming that we get the CARES funding in time, is about $20.5 million deficit for fiscal 20. That's actually improved from what I had shown last month, as I mentioned, because the non-COVID related expenses are less than budgeted, so that is improving the bottom line. So turning to the 2021 budget, I'm just going to highlight some of the changes from the presentation that we gave last month. We did add an additional 10 employees for sanitation at our facilities. That takes the total number of increased full-time equivalent positions in next year's budget to 68 that would be dedicated to sanitation and cleanliness. We're assuming minimal ridership and revenue reductions, as Catherine had mentioned, that will simplify our ability to invoice for CARES Act funds to the FTA. There'll also be some shortfalls in real estate revenues that we can make up through CARES Act funding. On the positive side, as I mentioned, with procurement assistance, we were able to lock in very favorable diesel fuel prices for next year. So that is going to positively impact the 2021 budget to the tune of about $2.8 million. And as I mentioned last month, due to limitations on travel, our travel budgets within the department have gone down. So just looking forward, in terms of cash utilization, currently have been at the tune of about $7 to $8 million per month due to the reduced revenue. The monthly cash utilization for the 2021 budget could be high if those passengers continued and passenger revenues remain low. Also, cash utilization for 2021 will fluctuate depending on the availability of local sales tax, and the local operating subsidy shortfall excuse me, could be impacted as high as $42 million, depending on the impact to the sales tax revenue. We do have weekly consultations with Allegheny County to come up with some other measures to hopefully mitigate some of that $42 million impact to the Port Authority's bottom line. And loss of turnpike revenues, if there is if the turnpike does not make any payments in fiscal 21, would definitely impact our entire capital projects. Historically, it hasn't had much of an impact on our operating revenue. So the state operating income is currently at about a 2.3% increase. Our state capital funding is at $114.5 million. As I mentioned, we're just showing as a placeholder a small amount of CARES funding budgeted, but it will be in the tens of millions of dollars, at least based on the actuals for April and May. Capitalizations, which are federal, state, and local funds that are permitted to be used to offset operating expenses, are $1.1 million less than fiscal 20, just because of the availability. Our pension expense is almost $3 million higher than fiscal 20, and hopefully, depending on how the markets look at the end of December, they could increase dramatically going into fiscal 2022. So depending on the what CARES funding we're able to get in the door by June 30th, we're hoping that we can maintain our operating reserves at about $130 million. This budget also includes projected increases for ATU and also the IBW agreement that was approved and ratified at last month's meeting. There's money in for a non-represented merit program. We have placeholders for healthcare at 10%, but as I mentioned, that'll be subject to further negotiations. And I mentioned pension expense. So this is looking at the expenses for the 2021 budget. So we're showing the 2020 budget of about $461 million, and the 2021 budget increasing to $485.6 million. You can see the percentage and dollar increases, the major expense categories listed there. And as I've mentioned at prior meetings, this is a people business, so almost 75% of our expenses go towards salary and wages and pension and benefits. Here's our revenue at a very high level. So we're at $104.1 million, which is down slightly from the 2020 budget. We were projecting, even pre-COVID, that our passenger revenues in particular were down from what had been budgeted in 2020. So that is basically the delta there between 2020 and 2021. If you look for, in terms of where our largest sources come from, the state at 55%, passenger revenue at 18% of our total budget. Our deferred revenue, which is the piggy bank per se, is at 9%, Allegheny County at 8%, and the federal government also at 8%. So if you look at our use of deferred state revenue, so this is excluding the CARES funding. So in the 2020 budget, we were using about $22.8 million of deferred revenue for our reserves, and the 2021 budget is balanced using $42.7 million of our reserve funding. From a headcount perspective, as I mentioned, most of these jobs that are being added are related to cleanliness and sanitation campaign of the 89 total. So this is a new slide. It was actually developed last week when we had a meeting with our Allegheny County delegation. And so this shows projected usage of $141.7 million. So for fiscal 20, which is on the left-hand side of that, we are projecting that we would use almost $20 million in this year's budget towards our revenue shortfall. Subsidy shortfall, we would use about $27.4 million. And deferred revenue, assuming that that's an allowable usage of CARES funding, would be almost another $23 million. So total of the $141 million, we would be using about $61 million just for this 3-month period. Going into next year, in addition to balancing the budget with $42 million in reserves, we would be showing that we would use the remainder, or not the entire 141, but almost 34 of it towards the revenue shortfall or projected revenue shortfall, subsidy shortfall of $40.8 million, and then if there's any, if we're good towards expenses or under budget on expenses, obviously that would prolong the availability of CARES Act funding. And this also doesn't include if there were some additional Allegheny County funding available to make up for the sales tax shortfall. So this is also an addition from last month. This just shows a pro forma fiscal 22 projected operating deficit, assuming benefit increases, current head count, wage increases. We would be using about a little over $60 million of the reserves in order to balance the 2022 budget. Preliminary capital budget, as I mentioned, we're assuming $114.5 million in state funding. And this would include, this current budget includes money for our debt service, what we're legally obligated to make. It also includes new buses, support for operating budget capitalization, and there's also money that would be appropriated for the BRT project included in this. I won't get into all this because this hasn't changed from last month, but 2.7 towards the bridge and tunnel improvement, 28.8 towards fixed guideway, the bus rapid transit construction 32, 4.5 towards some IT projects. There's just a picture of the 40-foot Gellings, clean diesel. Next. Yeah, and this just breaks it down in terms of high source areas, federal, state, and county, and then also just shows you at a very high level the various high-level capital program areas that we would use to get to the budget of $131.1 million. Much like the operating budget, the state is the largest benefactor towards the 2021 capital budget as well. And I won't belabor the uses. So happy to answer any questions.
I don't think I have any questions because I also want to second the thanks to the staff because I feel like despite all this uncertainty, you've given us a ton of information and I feel very, very well informed about the position that we're in right now and going forward. So I do want to thank everyone, Catherine, Pete, and the staff.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions?
And I would just like, this is Jen Liptak. Thank you. And I would just like to echo your comments. I feel very well informed and I thank the staff for their thoroughness and all the information they've provided us for us to review to feel comfortable with this budget.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
This is Michelle, and I thank all of you, Jen, Madam Chair, and Pete and staff. So I thank you very much for all of this great information. So well done. All right, thank you.
Okay, are we, go ahead, Pete.
Oh, I was just going to introduce or read the resolution for your consideration. It's a authorization to adopt the fiscal 2021 operating and capital budgets. This resolution authorizes the passage of the operating and capital budgets for Port Authority of Allegheny County. The operating budget totals $661,889. Capital budget is $131,191,888, and both budgets anticipate expense and balance anticipated expenses and revenues.
Okay. Do I have a motion to send the capital and operating budgets to the board next week for approval?
This is Jen Liptak. I make that motion.
Austin Davis, I second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you very much.
All right, Pete, do you want to then, we can move on to the next agenda item to review the May 2020 financial statements. Pete, you want to go ahead?
Thank you very much. So our total operating income was $7.55 million under budget for the month of May, and for the fiscal year, we're $14.5 million under budget. These variances are related to reduced passenger revenues for both Port Authority and the Access Shared Ride revenues. And as I mentioned, they should both be eligible for CARES Act funding. Our total expenses for the month were $3.7 million under budget and do remain under budget for the fiscal year. Every expense category other than salary and wages is currently under budget, and this variance will help prolong CARES Act funding usage. Our total subsidies for the month of May were $18.35 million under budget, and this was primarily due to a shortfall in local subsidies and also the deferred state operating assistance of $11 million. The subsidy for the fiscal year is $9.9 million under budget due to lower local subsidies. CARES Act funding should be able to absorb that shortfall for both April and May. So we're anticipating that the first CARES Act funding invoice would be $22.2 million, and that will be shared at future Finance Committee meetings to be transparent in terms of the amount that's being drawn down on a monthly basis. Our year-over-year comparison of May of 20 versus 19, total operating income is $14.7 million below last fiscal year. Passenger revenue is the majority of that, $14.5 million lower than last fiscal year. Total expense for the month was $951,000 less than last May. For the total, for fiscal year, our total expenses are $3.5 million higher, and as I've mentioned before, that is somewhat mitigated by the fact that we had that railroad settlement of $2.5 million, which was not a budgeted item. Total subsidies are $11.5 million lower than last fiscal year, and that's due to using less preventive maintenance and also lower local subsidies and its impact on the sales tax. From an operating reserve perspective, we began the month of May with $165.9 million in operating reserves. We received $12.5 million in cash revenues. Our cash outlay was $31.4 million for payroll, health care, pension, and other operating expenses. So our May operating reserves were down to $147 million at the end of May. Any questions on any of those items?
I do
Thank you
not.
very much.
Oh, actually, Pete, you have not put in a CARES Act invoice yet. Is that correct?
No, we have not. We are still working with FTA, and then we're also working with Allegheny County because they may have some funds other than local subsidy which are eligible to offset some of the additional expenses that we incurred. So we have to make sure that that is consistent, and obviously we can't have any double billing. So I would anticipate that in the next week to 2 weeks that we will be able to have our first invoice. And like I said, we will share that and we can even put it out on our website so that the public is aware of how the drawdowns are progressing.
Great. Thank you. Okay, well, that was our last item on the agenda, so I will seek a motion to adjourn.
Austin Davis, so moved.
Jen Liptak, second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, the meeting is adjourned, and we'll talk to you all next month. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to get ready to move forward with the Performance Oversight Committee. And we have at least 5 items for resolutions today. So I'm hoping that Austin, you're still on the phone with us. And
Yep, I'm still here.
And Representative Lori, are you on the phone with us this morning?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Good morning. Our first item of business then will be approval of the minutes of the May 21st Performance Oversight Committee meeting. So if you could go ahead, if there are any questions, otherwise I would entertain a motion to approve.
A motion to approve?
Thank you. Do I have a second? Austin?
Jeff is seconding.
Second.
Great. And all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very
Aye.
much. Okay, so that's the approval of the May 21st meeting. Our first resolution that we have this morning is awarding bids with Mr. Tony Trona. Good morning, Tony.
Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. I have 3 items for your review and recommendations to the full board for approval. The first, coach replacement parts suspension. All of our bids today were publicly advertised and e-business documents were distributed. 3 firms accepted our invitation. 3 bids were received for the replacement parts over a 2-year period. Our recommendation is that the contract be awarded to the low bidders. Gillig LLC, 2 items, an estimated amount of $125,169. Aftermarket parts, 3 items, estimated amount of $46,924.20. This price represents a 1% increase over the previous contract for these items 2 years ago. The second, primary suspension springs for our LRV. 2 firms accepted the invitation. 2 bids were received for the suspension springs for the authority's LRV fleet over a 3-year period. So our recommendation that the contract be awarded to the low bidder, which was CAF USA, estimated amount $326,400. This price represents a 10% increase from the previous contracted prices 3 years ago. Number 3, non-revenue vehicles, state scheduled co-stars. At the board's February 2020 meeting, the board authorized a contract with Bill McCandless Ford for 9 Ford Fusion sedans in the amount of $174,339 under the Commonwealth's co-stars program. When the pandemic emergency took effect, it essentially shut down the automotive industry. Ford was in their last model year for the Ford Fusion at that time. When the contract was released to them through McCandless Ford, they said the car was no longer available because Ford was now going to cancel the rest of the production year on that car. The authority's non-revenue manager determined that a suitable replacement would be the Ford Escort SUV, which is also on the co-stars program, which we also purchased some off of the February 2020 meeting. They are still available under co-stars. That contract under co-stars is effective through August 8, 2020. And the Port Authority wishes to purchase a total of 9 vehicles under the same terms and conditions as co-stars contract for these SUVs. So my recommendation is that the award for the 9 Ford Fusion sedans be rescinded with Bill McCandless Ford, and the contract be awarded for the same terms and conditions under the co-stars for the following. Bill McCandless Ford for 9 vehicles, Ford Escorts, in amount of $219,654. The staff has determined that the pricing on the Pennsylvania state schedule be fair and reasonable. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Trona. Do I have any questions from our board members on these changes or the availability of the cars and the replacement of the Ford Escorts?
Yes, I have a question. So you believe then that the Ford Escorts are an appropriate replacement for what you originally wanted?
That's correct.
As in, you know, size and gas mileage and those kind of things?
That is correct.
Thank you.
All right, hearing no other questions, if I could have a motion and a second to move this forward to next week's board meeting for approval.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries. Moving on to the item B, authorization to enter into fourth amendments to designated service agreements with the university PAAC program participants with Mr. Mike Petra. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Madam Committee Chairwoman and committee members. This first resolution I have for the committee's consideration this morning would authorize Port Authority to extend its current UPAS agreements with the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, and Chatham University. The current agreements were entered into in 2012, and the PIT agreement is set to expire absent further extension on June 30th, 2020, CMU's on July 31st, 2020, and Chatham's on September 30th, 2020. Among other terms and conditions, the current agreements with the UPAS program participants provide that each university pay Port Authority a fee of 50% of Port Authority's base fare per tap, which currently equates to $1.25 per card tap ride taken by eligible university cardholders. They tap their university-issued identification cards, and the universities manage, which IDs work on our vehicles for riding. We have negotiated proposed 1-year as-is extensions with each university due to the uncertainty created by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to provide Port Authority additional time as COVID-19 restrictions are easing to resume the work with our fare modeling consultant to develop our long-term fare strategy and structure, which we anticipate will include long-term recommendations for the UPAS program. So these proposed extensions essentially provide us another year status quo while that is done. Subject to any questions that members may have, I'd respectfully request the committee recommend this resolution to the full board for approval.
Any questions of board members for Mike on the UPAS program? Hearing no questions, could I have a motion and a second to move this forward to next month's board meeting?
This is Lori. So moved.
Second.
Great. In favor of the resolution, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Any opposed? Motion carries. Then moving it forward. Continuing with Mike Cetra for authorization to enter into agreements with a pool of firms for investigative services.
Yes, thank you, Madam Committee Chairwoman. The second resolution I have for the committee's consideration this morning would authorize Port Authority to enter into agreements with a pool of firms to provide Port Authority investigative services on an as-needed basis via task-specific work orders. The services provided under these agreements would include external investigation and related professional services to support our processing and defense of workers' compensation, non-occupational and related personal injury claims, commonly includes assignments for locating and interviewing witnesses to accidents, gathering documentary and other evidence that may not be readily available otherwise, and transporting claimants to independent medical examinations if they do not have transportation. In March of 2020, Port Authority issued RFP number 2005 seeking a pool of firms to provide these services. Following the receipt and evaluations of proposals by a staff evaluation committee, it's recommended that Port Authority enter into agreements with a pool of 5 firms: CSI Corporate Security Investigations, Specialty Private Investigators, Investigated Services Group, Inc., Command Investigations, LLC, and Giddings Private Investigations and Security, Inc. I'd also highlight that Investigative Services Group is a certified DBE/DB firm. The agreements would be for an initial term of 3 years with the option to extend them up to 2 years at Port Authority's sole discretion, and a total not to exceed amount for all agreements of $200,000. Again, that would be allocated on task-specific work orders, case assignments. Subject to any questions members may have, I would respectfully request that the committee recommend this resolution to the full board for approval next Friday.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Sutter. Board members, any questions?
No.
Okay, hearing no questions from board members, if I could have a motion and a second to move this forward to the full board meeting next week.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Great, motion carries. So,
Thank you.
Mike, are we moving on with our presentation at this point, or are you going to continue now with the adopt and implement the Port Authority's public transportation safety plan?
Madam Committee Chairwoman, before I present the resolution seeking the committee's recommendation to adopt and implement the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, as I'm sure committee members noted, it's a very large document with a lot of different components. So I'm going to invite our Chief Safety Officer, Bert Jennings, up to provide we'll try to keep it relatively brief, but an overview presentation on the plan, and then with your clearance, I will then come back up and present the resolution.
Very good. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Bert, all yours.
Good morning, Bert. Welcome. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman, and all other committee members and board members. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you today, and I thank you for your time and attention to this important change and upgrade in Port Authority's safety plan. So to go to the first slide, if you could, please, Jeff. The key requirements for the PTAS that we've been working on for the past couple of years starts off really with meeting the FTA rules and guidance that was set forth. We'll talk a little more about those on a subsequent slide. But this is the transit agency guide to more effectively manage safety risks. It establishes processes and procedures to support the implementation of a new method of doing safety for us, which is called safety management systems. And it describes the safety responsibilities of management and the employees of Port Authority and the processes we use to get to this safe system and using the SMS as the basis. It's reviewed and approved by PennDOT's Rail Transit Safety Review Program. And to do that, they use an extensive checklist that they develop. And I should note here that PennDOT also has the power to effectively enhance what they want done. They have to do at least what FTA wants, but they have the power and the authority to enhance further what they desire to be done. And in some cases, we do see that. The plan, the PTAS will be updated annually, just as our system safety program plan was in the past. And this is a continued focus area for Port Authority's tactical and strategic planning. I think I'm going to take the mask off here before I suffocate.
Go ahead, you're good. We are distant.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Catherine. The four main components of SMS, as you can see, are displayed on the next slide. And those are safety policy, safety assurance, safety risk management, and safety promotion. The policy, the assurance, and the safety risk management really work together in kind of a circular fashion. Each one can be adjusted and changed as time moves forward and audit findings or inspection findings are noticed and corrective actions are applied. So each of those work together. The fourth, the safety promotion, that includes all safety training and training in general, one could say, and communications or safety messaging. And the communications and training are very important in getting out that positive safety culture to all the levels of the workforce. Okay, next slide. What does the SMS mean for Port Authority and the PTAS? Safety is decentralized under the SMS approach. You have a commitment and direction from the executive level of the company all the way down through to every employee. Safety becomes the company-wide culture. That's the goal. And I really think Port Authority has been very close to that goal for many, many years, even under the System Safety Program plan. CEO is the accountable executive. The Chief Safety Officer is the SMS executive. The Safety Department's role is looking at data, hazards, risks, accident investigations, and so forth. And when we find issues looking at all that material, we then go to operations and say, you know, we see a hazard here. This is something we believe we need to address. And then actually operations takes the lead role in addressing the problem or the hazard. Safety serves as a supporting consultant to assist. Effective communication, up, down, and across the entire organization, and appropriate training for all personnel. Why is Port Authority adopting a PTAS? This is going back to the federal rules promulgated under FTA that have come out over the past several years. It started back in October 2012 with MAP 21 laws being put into effect. And those required the DOT and FTA to act on transit safety, to try to improve transit safety across the nation. Most of that came about due to bad accidents that occurred, not here in Pittsburgh at Port Authority, but at several large agencies across the nation. So they rolled out new laws to try to address that and make things better. 49 CFR 674 required states to develop their programs and have them certified by FTA. Same thing for rail transit agencies. Develop safety programs, and they had to be certified by FTA and through the power of the state safety oversight agencies. 673, that just came out in July 2018, requires transit agencies with rail transit systems or more than 100 buses to replace their system safety program plan with the PTAS, or Public Transit Agency Safety Plan. The original deadline was July 2020, and we're going to meet that goal here at Port Authority, I feel very strongly. But they have extended the actual deadline to December 31st of this year due to the delays caused by the pandemic. And 49 CFR 672, which also rolled out July 2018, addressed training. And this was to make sure the agencies and the state safety oversight and contractors and consultants all have an adequate level of safety training. And so they put that program in. There are a list of classes, and we actually take classes from TSI, the Transportation Safety Institute, which is another branch of the DOT. Our PTAS process here at Port Authority. We had an SMS awareness presentation and SMS principles training provided to the board. Some of you probably remember that. It's been maybe 2 years back or getting close to that. Key management and labor union representatives were also trained by safety personnel and what to expect. So then the next step, system safety, the legal department, and our safety plan sub-consultant that we hired, we formed a team to lead the PTASP effort. The system safety program plan was fully reviewed by the consultant, and they also came in and performed a gap analysis, and that was a sit-down interview with a lot of management and even include the board chair to get an idea of where we were at in our current safety program and discover what needed to be done to increase it and satisfy the PTAS program rules. So that was completed, and the initial draft was then put out by the safety consultant. They sent it to us. We made comments. It went through a couple drafts. But basically, a lot of back and forth work occurred between Port Authority and the consultant, and then we sent it to PennDOT for first round. PennDOT reviewed it against their extensive checklist, sent us back a lot of comments. We again attacked and addressed all those comments, and then we sent it out to our senior staff for another look. We addressed their comments. It went back to PennDOT, and PennDOT has approved the document conditionally. They won't sign off on it until our board chair and our CEO approve it also. So we are down there really toward the bottom of this list, and I'm very, very happy to be standing here today and telling you that. It's been a long process and a lot of work, but the document has really increased greatly in how good it looks and how good it reads, thanks to the consultant, the legal team, my Deputy Chief Safety Officer. It's really been a great thing, and thank you to the board and to Catherine and all the senior staff for giving us the hiring of the sub-consultant. That was a great move, so thank you so much. Okay, Jeff. Components, we talked about this a little bit. Safety policy. Documentation includes the system description, safety accountabilities, and responsibilities. Safety risk management. That's your hazard identification, hazard analysis, and hazard rating. We do that with a matrix, which I will talk about in a minute. Safety assurance. This is your audits, inspections, accident investigations, management of change. What that is, when new equipment is introduced, or possibly a change in a bus route, or adding new bus stops, new hazards can be encountered when you do things like that. So that's why that's a part of the PTAS and a part of SMS. When new things are introduced, we have to assess them and make sure they are safe as well. Safety promotion, that's the training, the messaging, the communication. Under the COVID-19 pandemic that we've been going through, we've really upgraded communications here at Port Authority. Really thanks to Catherine and Jim Ritchie, they did a great job of instituting some new methods of getting messaging out to the employees, and it's worked very well. Expanded employee and contractor safety reporting. The safety reporting is a big part of SMS. We want to hear from the employees when they see a hazard or what they think is a potential hazard. If they see an accident that nearly happened but didn't happen, we call that a near miss. We would like to know about those things as well, because if we get a lot of near misses, let's say at a certain intersection in the city, we can go visit that intersection and try to determine what's going on that's causing these near misses. Non-punitive policy. This is the don't shoot the messenger. If someone brings to us an issue, we are glad to see them. We want to work with them on correcting issues. We don't want to throw the hammer against them and discipline them for something that they're trying to tell us about to improve the overall safety picture. Safety performance measurement by use of targets or goals. This is new and comes with the PTASP and SMS. In the past, setting goals and targets has largely been resisted. our target always was we want to continually improve. Well, under the new FTA rules, you have to set targets, which we have done, and they are included in the PTASP. We included a description of various safety committees and their function throughout the authority. And the last piece of this is that hazard rating, which provides us with a risk rating. We look at the frequency, and we also look at the severity of things. What's the chance that something is going to happen, and how bad will the result be? That's how we get that hazard rating or risk rating. So now you see the hazard resolution matrix that considers that severity and probability. Together, those two things give us our risk rating. So you can see down the left side is the severity: catastrophic, critical, marginal, or negligible. And across the top, the frequency or probability. So any hazard that's brought to us, we discuss it and we plug it into this matrix to try to determine what actual rating it would be. If it's up in that yellow section, you'll note that those are all deemed unacceptable. And that means a high-level decision needs to be made, and made soon, sometimes immediately. Something that is a 1A and involves a lot of people, that could go clear to our CEO for a decision on shutting down immediately if we find 1A hazards in operations. So this matrix has been around for years, but it is a good matrix, a good tool. Promoting safety culture, hazards and risks are sought out, no shooting the messenger. I discussed that. We also have an anonymous reporting method. Everyone's vigilant. People are trained to recognize hazards. When the hazard's known, we investigate, we mitigate. Responsibility for safety is shared across the system. Performance standards were established and will be monitored. Safety messaging is going out. Goal setting and recognition awards for good performance are also included, and of course training, very important. That's really all I have. I hope everyone finds that to be a good presentation. There's some fire department training you see going on there on that last slide. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Thank you, Bert. Do we have any questions from our board members on Bert Jennings and his report on the safety issues? Anybody? Board members, please.
No,
Michelle.
but thank you for the report.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes.
It's John. I guess I'm connected. Hey, first of all, just a comment. I mean, I read that report, and it is lengthy and it is detailed, but I got to tell you, I learned so much about the authority by just reading that. It was really an excellent report. And my comments, I think, to Mike were wow. And one question I did have, would you answer about the effects of COVID, which was one of the questions. Mike Cetra, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Now, I sent you an email, and you got that response. You got those questions I asked you?
I don't know if I did, John. Was it this morning?
Well, I'll resend them to you, but that was the only comment I had. But I just wanted to comment on the report itself. And all I said, as I said, my response was wow. So thank you very much, Bert.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Thank you, Mr. Tague, and I'll be on the lookout for that email. I apologize if that came through already. I did not see it, though. Madam Committee Chairwoman, with your permission, I can proceed to present the resolution.
Please do.
Okay, thank you. And just very quickly, I again want to reiterate, I think Bert said it very well, but I also want to thank Bert for all of his work on this. We've had support and the resources we needed to get it done. It was quite an effort, and both Catherine's leadership, Chairman Letwin taking time out of his schedule to interview with the sub-consultant and provide his input from a board capacity on our safety program and improvements we could make to it. labor union leadership, et cetera. It was really a collective effort, so we do appreciate everyone helping us to get to this point where, despite the challenges of the pandemic and needing to divert, the majority of our safety resources the last several months, we were still able, with some nights and some weekends, to stay on track and be before you this month. As you heard during the presentation, the FTA issued the rule requiring transit agencies that receive federal transit funds and operate over 100 buses and/or a light rail system to phase out their system safety program plan and replace it with a PTASP. Again, the original adoption deadline was July 20, 2020, but FTA recently granted some additional time, only if needed, for agencies to complete their plans by the end of the year if they were delayed by the pandemic. A copy of our proposed PSASP is attached to the resolution in your packets as Exhibit A. I won't repeat, as Bert covered for you, the material components of the PTASP. The resolution would adopt the PTASP for Port Authority with the start of our new fiscal year, effective July 1, 2020, and it would authorize designated management and staff to implement it. It further reserved the right to make material amendments to the plan to the board. So as we do these annual updates, we will bring this back to the board. It is now a board-level plan, whereas the prior system safety program plan was a management-level plan. So the board will see this and proposed updates to it each year. Madam Committee Chairwoman, with that being said, and subject to any remaining questions the committee members may have, I'd respectfully request that the committee recommend this resolution to the full board for approval.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bert, and the full committee for that. A very intensive report. So any other questions from our board members before we proceed with this? Okay, hearing no questions for either Bert Jennings or Mike Setra, then I would request a motion and a second to move this forward to our full committee meeting. Austin and Lori, are you still with us?
Yes, this is Lori, so moved.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Very good. Motion carries. And then we're coming up on our final item and resolution for today, continuing with Mike Setra, authorization to enter an agreement to provide professional safety consulting and safety security management services. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Madam Committee Chairwoman. My final resolution for this morning, then I think I'm going to have a glass of water, is for the committee's consideration would authorize Port Authority to enter into an agreement to provide Port Authority with professional safety consulting and safety security management services. The services provided under this agreement would include safety and regulatory compliance and assistance, including most critically, adopting the PTASP is step one. Implementing it system-wide is then the next step, and so really the PTASP is the starting point, and SMS implementation is your end goal. So this consultant would help us with the training and the program management to roll this out system-wide, and help us with augment our internal safety personnel where needed for accident incident investigation, other safety security plans that we maintain, such as our pandemic plan, updating those plans as needed, and just being there to assist us and augment our staff internally as we continue to move forward with adjusting our safety program to be under the PTASP SMS system. In February of 2020, Port Authority issued RFP number 2003, seeking a qualified firm to provide these services. Following the receipt and evaluations of proposals by a staff evaluation committee, it's recommended that Port Authority enter into an agreement with K&J Safety and Security Consulting, Inc. to provide the safety consulting services. The evaluation summary of K&J and the other shortlisted firm, ADS System Safety Consultant, are included in the summary of the resolution in your packets this morning. But briefly, K&J, which I note is a certified DBE/DB firm, provided a detailed work plan, a project manager certified by the FTA in both bus and rail safety, which is critical now under the SMS system. That project manager also had bus and rail safety and chief safety officer experience at large transit agencies. Additionally, K&J's proposed costs were within the range of our independent cost estimate and were deemed fair and reasonable. This agreement would be for an initial term of 3 years with the option to extend it up to 2 additional years at Port Authority's sole discretion. and for a total not to exceed amount up to $860,000, and this would be allocated over the life of the agreement via tax-specific work orders. Subject to any questions members may have, I'd respectfully request the committee recommend this resolution to the full board for approval.
Great, thank you, Mr. Setra. Any questions from our board members for this resolution for Mike Setra? If not, I would entertain a motion and a second to move this forward to our full board meeting next week, please.
This is Lori, so moved.
Austin Davis, second.
In favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. That concludes our agenda for the performance oversight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other further business to be? Okay, I'm seeing the Port Authority mission statement coming up. I'm going to adjourn the Performance Oversight Committee, but do we have any other committees coming up after us?
That concludes our day.
That concludes our day. All right. I thank you, everyone, for your time and patience. We're just about ready to hit the 2-hour mark. So thank you to staff, board members, and everybody that listened on the call today. All right. And as always, if you have questions, you can contact us. All right. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.